can also see this in air temperature records, for example. So this is work we have been done some time ago together with Takahide Sakamoto. And what we did was studying how does this fractal dimension in the sense of Higuchi behaves for air temperature records when you have a seasonal component or when you have removed the seasonal component. And what we found was when we removed the seasonal component, we have more or less a straight line with a slope of almost 2. It's not exactly 2, but it's quite close to it. But when we have a seasonal trend, we again found here a crossover time scale of the order of 2 to 3 weeks. And everything which is below this time scale, so which refers to the short-term features of the time scale, is pretty much the same as for the trended version, but there's a second scaling region which gives rise to much shorter, much lower values of this D0 or capacity dimension. And this might be some indication also for the long-term persistence, but on first hand, this is an indication of the influence of the seasonal trend, which induces, in fact, something which you would detect as long-term persistence. Okay. Another issue is that fractal dimensions, in particular, if you have a rather complex and not necessarily fully homogeneous nonlinear system, is that this capacity dimension may also depend on the spatial location. So, for example, when you have a system which looks like this, so maybe that's a sort of caricature of the so-called Lorentz system. You may compute fractal dimension in this area. You might compute the fractal dimension in this area, and you might get different results from this. Not necessarily, so in the case of this Lorentz system, you won't get different results, but there are other examples where you really have a dependence of your box counting dimension dB on your particular point in your phase space. So that's one point. And the second point is usually you want to have more information. You don't only want to know how many boxes do I need to cover my object here in this phase space. You also would like to consider how likely is it to find my system in one of these boxes. And this gives rise to the notion of generalized dimensions, or so-called Rényi dimensions, after some mathematician from Hungary. And the idea behind this is the so-called ergodicity hypothesis, that it's basically the same for most systems, whether you take the time average for the long-term evolution of one trajectory, or whether you take just a very large set of trajectories and look only how do they behave for a short time. If you do the second one, you can cover your phase space usually much more efficiently than with only one trajectory. So that's the idea. And if we now consider the probabilities of residence of one trajectory, of any trajectory from such a set in different boxes I, you can define generalized dimensions in that sense. So that's just a mathematical object. But what you can see is if you let this exponent q approach 0, you will again end up in the limit with the same definition as you have for this capacity dimension I've shown you on the slides before. So that's the point. So if q becomes close to 0, the actual probabilities do not matter anymore so much. What matters in this case is just whether or not you find your object in a specific box. So this, maybe you can understand this quite easily. when you just consider values of this probability pi in the interval between 0 and 1. So when I have q equal to 1, it's just a linear function. When I have a very large q, the function will look like this. So this means I will more or less only count boxes which have a very large probability of residence. And if I let q go towards 0, it looks like this. So I have more effects also from boxes which are only covered with a lower probability. Yes, so that's the idea. And in the limit, I just have only information whether or not I have the coverage of my box or not. So it's a certain generalization. And the point is, we can then compare the values of these different generalized dimensions. And if they have the same value, we have again some fractal behavior. So it's very similar to this long-term persistence, which we had in the morning lecture of today. And if these different generalized dimensions have not the same values, we have a more complicated structure, a so-called multifractal structure. So multifractal means we cannot characterize our process, our system, by just one fractal dimension, but there is a certain scaling of the fractal dimensions. And indeed, this is also related to the pointwise dimension. So one can prove that if the pointwise dimensions are not the same, then you have also multifractal behavior. So this is more or less a closed theory behind these different notations. Okay, I would only briefly like to mention that beside these different notions of embedding dimension, integer embedding dimension on the one hand, and fractal dimension in a geometric sense on the other hand, you can also combine these different approaches into a third class of dimension estimates. And if you would like to see something more about these kind of dimension estimates and how one can apply them to problems from climatology, you are cordially invited to my seminar talk next Wednesday, where I will address in particular that kind of approaches. Okay, from the generalized dimensions, we can also draw some relationship to the problems of nonlinear interdependencies between different values in a time series. So just to remind you, this is the structure for the definition of a generalized dimension. And the object which we have here in the numerator of this ratio is called the Regnier entropy of order Q. So entropies are quantities which quantify the disorder of a distribution. So that's more or less the idea. So when I have a certain probability distribution, let's say something like a histogram of the probability of my system to be in different boxes. When I have only a few boxes that contribute, I will have an entropy which is low. So I call it HQ here. It will be low. On the other hand, when I have many boxes which are more or less equally occupied, then I would have high values. That means more or less I have a good idea for predicting the position of the state of my system, because there are many, many different states which are more or less equally frequent. So this is maybe some heuristic interpretation of this.